Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple different reasons. The first of which, take my brain out of more background work over the course of the week and move into the process of writing and preparing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason. And the second is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason brought you here today, whether you are a regular viewer or if this is the first time you have ever watched one of these videos, to allow you to gain some different insight into the assigned text for the week. So that is why I do these. And as always, a big thank you for tuning in and viewing. I know it takes time to go through these videos, and I do appreciate you when you do. So, hey, kudos. This particular Sunday, July 29th, 2018, the 10th Sunday after Pentecost, our assigned gospel text is moving into the book of John, or the Gospel of John, I should say. We are going to be in John now for the next 5 weeks. This is a point in the lectionary cycle, the 3-year cycle, when we deviate away from Mark's gospel, excuse me, for a period of time and move into John for what is known as the Bread of Life discourse. This stems from the feeding of the 5,000, which is the main portion of the story for today. And then in John's gospel, we oftentimes see that when he performs a sign, which is what John calls the miracles, the signs, then he talks about it for a while. And this one is a lengthy one. It encompasses the entirety of chapter 6 of John's gospel, and it's like 70 some verses, so it's pretty long. We certainly don't hit the whole thing today, but over the course of the next 5 weeks, that is the accumulation of the various texts as we continue to move on through it. Yeah, so that's where we're at. So we're kicking it off today. Again, the vast majority of what we have is this is the event itself, the feeding of the 5,000. However, it also, there's a odd little tack on, if we want to call it that, that occurs at the end, and it encompasses the last few verses of what I'll read here momentarily. And it's the event of Jesus walking on water. Now, this one is interestingly paired up with the feeding of the 5,000. A side note, the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle that is featured in all 4 Gospels. All 4 Gospels recount this story for us. Most of the events that happen, or the details within them, are pretty similar. But then the walking on water is then immediately following in 3 out of the 4. It's here in John, and it's also in Matthew and Mark. Just the same way. There's the miracle itself, and then Jesus kind of sends the people away and goes off to the mountain by himself for some away time, some alone time, and the disciples start going across the Sea of Galilee and have issues in the storm, and Jesus comes walking out to them. So we see that partnered up in 3 out of the 4. Along with this important story, this important miracle, which does happen in all 4. It's one of the rare stories to happen in all 4 Gospels of the feeding of 5,000. So that context being set, let's go ahead and jump in. Now, again, this is long. It's like 21 verses, so it's going to take me a couple of minutes to read through. But if you want, fast forward. Otherwise, read it yourself. If you want to hit pause, you could do that, but I'm going to read it, so why would you hit pause? Anyway, let's jump in. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we going to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, and also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up. From the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near to the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land where they were going. All right, so that's the passage. Again, this is the miracle itself, followed up then by the miracle of Jesus walking on water, witnessed apparently only by the disciples, but so that's the entirety. And then in the weeks to come, then we'll get the discourse portion of it. So some thoughts on what's going on here. A lot of thoughts of what's happening. There's a lot of individual little aspects that kind of seem important or seem fitting to focus on. And kind of one of the first ones that I'm pondering on, and I honestly I don't really know what to make of this, is why does John tell us that the festival of the Passover is near? We do know from John's gospel that this is where the 3-year cycle of Jesus' ministry comes about, because there are 3 instances when Jesus goes to the Passover in Jerusalem. What's odd about this is it takes place around or on the Sea of Galilee, which is in the north. It's quite a ways away from Jerusalem, which is where they would be to celebrate the Passover. And this is almost a throwaway comment that Jesus is attracting these large crowds around Jerusalem, but the festival of the Passover is coming near, and then we go on about it, and that raises the question. And again, and I don't necessarily know what to make of this. At Passover, they celebrate liberation. The Passover was the event. It was the 10th plague in Egypt, going all the way back to Exodus, when they were freed from their slavery in Egypt. So it is a celebration of liberation from bondage. It's a celebration of God's, well, the name the Passover. The angel of death passed over their houses because of the blood of the lamb that was over the door. If you're familiar with the Ten Commandments movie, you're aware of that. So that's going on. It's a celebration of many things, and of God's grace for them, of God's love and mercy and protection of them. That's all celebrated in the Passover. So maybe that's worth noting, but it's confusing why it's in here, and I admittedly don't really have a good answer for it, but it's worth noting that it's there. Moving on. So we have this situation that the crowds are following Jesus, and we hear within here it's because of the signs that he performs for the sick, that he heals the sick. And that's the same mentality that seems to be behind within the rest of the Gospels as well, that Jesus is healing the sick. That seems to be the primary miracle that he's doing, and perhaps we could call that small scale of what he's doing, because we don't we hear accounts of it, but there's a lot of it, and there oftentimes we'll hear in the narrative that he was healing the sick that were there, or that they were bringing the sick for him to be healed. And so the crowds keep on coming. Even if he's out in the not so much the wilderness, but even if he's out in the rural areas away from towns or settlements, it seems that the crowds keep following him. And that seems to be what's happening here as well. And now they're somewhere around the Sea of Galilee. Well, here he goes up a mountain, which I've talked about this in recent events or recent videos before. So the Sea of Galilee is kind of sitting in a bowl because there are mountains that kind of surround it. So we don't know exactly where this takes place around the sea. It's a pretty good sized lake, but it's somewhere along there. And so all these people come, and he poses the question, how are we going to feed them? Or we need to feed them. How are we going to do it? And it's interesting that he's testing them. Now, first we hear from Philip, and Philip seems to focus in on the financial aspect of the cost, the potential cost of it's going to take 6 months' wages, or 200 denarii, in order to, and that would only give each person a taste. And then Andrew apparently has also been scoping things out and has found the boy and says, well, here's a boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what is that among so many? And I wonder what other comments were coming from the rest of the disciples. We hear these 2. I'm sure there were probably concern or excuses or whatever that were coming from them too that we don't hear about. But it seems to be an idea of scarcity, that there's not enough, or this is what it's going to cost, and the cost is so huge. How can we do it? But Jesus knows what he's going to do. Has the people sit down. I always kind of laugh because John gives us this comment that there was a lot of grass there. I think that's perhaps an indication of something greater. If we think about, there's another discourse that's coming up a couple chapters later when Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd. He says, "I am the Good Shepherd. The sheep know my voice and they follow me. They follow the shepherd out, and he leads them to pasture. He has them rest in the pastures." And think about this. Well, where do you find grass? You find grassland in the pasture, and he has the people recline. That's here it says they sit down, but in the Greek it's they recline. They rest there, and they are fed. They are given sustenance. They're cared for by the shepherd, who is Jesus. Jesus is the shepherd. So part of me thinks that this whole deal is pointing at the abundant life that Jesus came to bring us. And this idea of abundance is I think, important and apropos to this. We hear when Jesus is talking about gathering up the fragments left over. Our translation, again, is not real spectacular here, but 2 times in that little brief passage, after everyone is eaten, when they're picking up everything left, Jesus talks about the abundance. Gather the abundance left over, so that none of the abundance will be wasted. And the only 2 times that word shows up in John's gospel. It shows up at other times in the New Testament, but this is the only time that John uses it to speak of the abundance of what Jesus had somehow provided through this miraculous sign. Now, oftentimes I hear discussions trying to explain away the miracle, or explain the miracle, or to say to understand what happened. And some will say that we can take it at face value that somehow Jesus took this tiny amount and divinely multiplied it, or we could say that there was a bit of a stone soup situation going on, that the boy shares it, and when Jesus blesses that and shows gratitude for it, that makes other people think, okay, well, we've got a little, let's share it. We have a little, let's share it. I don't like that explanation, because it kind of actually takes away from the divine nature of what happens. That all Jesus is doing here is shaming people into actually sharing. And while there is the important idea of, yes, we're called to share out of our abundance, share that which we have with those who don't. I don't think that's what's happening here, but I don't know. We're not told exactly what happens, other than somehow this little bit becomes enough, and there's this abundance left over. And I wonder aloud, or I'm wondering aloud, I'm thinking aloud about this idea of scarcity versus abundance. That maybe what we think we need to have, or the answers to our issues, are not how God sees it in this abundant life that Jesus came to bring to us, that we may have life and have it abundantly. Jesus himself says that. And typically, I fear, and my own brain does this too, we tend to go towards money. There's never enough money. But it's not just about money. That's probably the ever-loving dollar at work. But we never have enough time. We never have enough resources. We never have enough of this or that, or this or that, or this or that. And yet, what do we have? And the reason that I key in on that is because Jesus takes the bread and he gives thanks for it. He gives thanks for what they have. And somehow God can make that enough. And maybe that's the only takeaway that we need to take from this miraculous sign, is that somehow God makes it enough. Now, this is not to say that if you just pray hard enough, or if you just have enough faith, that God will provide everything for you that you need, and you'll be blessed beyond measure. That's prosperity gospel. I don't buy that. But that what we look to, like for instance, what the disciples look to as the answer, is not what Jesus is looking at as the answer. And what we view as scarcity in God's economy, I've heard it called that, it is not only enough, but it's an abundance. And so what do we do with that? I don't necessarily know what we do with that, but it's something to ponder on. And finally, to wrap it up, I want to take a brief thought about the whole walking on water thing. and why I think that this is important, and perhaps why it's partnered up with the sign of the feeding of the 5,000. What's interesting is here in John's gospel, Jesus doesn't calm the storm. When we hear about it in the other gospels, Jesus walks out to the disciples on the water, which itself is miraculous. We don't hear about Peter coming into the water, which we hear about there, but in those, Jesus calms the storm. We also hear about a time when Jesus is actually in the boat with them and he's sleeping and he calms the storm too. So Jesus calms the storm several times throughout the course of the gospel stories. Here he doesn't do it, but he says when they're scared because they see him coming and he's getting near the boat, he says, in the Greek it's ego eimi, which means I am. It says, I am, fear not. It's me, don't be afraid. But he doesn't calm the storm. He is simply there with them in the midst of it, in the midst of the turmoil. The Word made flesh, God dwelling among us, the incarnate divine God is with them in the midst of the turmoil. And maybe that's the same that we can take from the feeding of the 5,000, that the presence of God is somehow enough, that it is somehow life-giving, that we are able to find hope even in the midst of the turmoil. I don't know. I'm reaching here, and I need to do some more pondering and some more work before I get a sermon out of this. But that's a lot of what's happening here. Maybe we connect it back to Psalm 23, which was actually part of the lectionary last week. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This abundant life, this good life, this sustained life is found with the one who is I am. I don't know. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, a better explanation of what's going on here, throw it down in the comment section. We'll continue the conversation that way. After this, I'm going to be on break for the next couple of weeks. I'm actually going to be off and gone on my annual pilgrimage to family camp with my family in the wonderful mountains of Colorado. So no videos the next couple of weeks. We'll be back 3 weeks from today. So I look forward to getting back with you at that point. Otherwise, hope you have a blessed few weeks, and we'll catch you next time.